Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
We are in show number 29 of Medieval Church History, and I think actually we're coming close to some of our early days of
the early modern church history.
Right.
Yeah, we'll actually be doing some overlapping on some of that. So some of the
Good,
material, some
refresher.
of the individuals will be a little. We'll remember some of them. Familiar with us?
The date we were talking time periods. I was thinking, well, this was around when we started those shows.
Yes. Yeah. Technically, we started in 1274
right. Exactly,
with the death of St. Thomas Aquinas, and who we'll be spending quite a time with. And we mentioned at that time also the death of St. Dominic, St. Francis, and we're just going to be in the next couple of our meetings where we'll be talking about them and their lives, their challenges during their lives, and the incredible religious orders that they'll be talking about, which is one of the orders we'll be talking about today also, is the Cistercians.
Oh, yes.
And how they came about. Last time around, we were talking also about the prosperity that came to Europe.
Right.
The cities and people were just living longer, eating better, drinking better, and having a grand old time. And the Cistercians actually play a role in that. But I do want to talk a little bit about the theology of money before we get into that.
Okay.
Because we were also at that last time around talking about money lending.
Yes.
The role of medieval banks, medieval fairs, the role of the Jewish community within Europe, and its ability to lend beyond the normal interest rates, because, as we had said before, they had to pay 10% up front on to the local lords, who acted as their collection agencies when they weren't able to collect on their own.
And that was because they weren't allowed to take the oath.
They were not allowed to. Well, yeah, they could not take the oath.
Right.
It wasn't
Allowed, but
yeah, the Christian community would love to for them to take an oath for under Jesus Christ, but of course they couldn't do that themselves, and being true to their own faith, and so there is that something of a glitch that happens in there. But I think it's important for us to remember that in this shift, I guess you could say, of the theology of money, that as Europe becomes more and more of a capital society rather than goods-based, it's going to begin that transition toward legal tender, toward money, that there are some bedrock ideas that are grounded in a Christian economy. And part of that is that sense of charity, that caritas is grounded in this. A sense that the poor are God's blessing to the rich. That's a lesson we're going to forget pretty consistently throughout our history. St. Vincent de Paul in modern times will come back and remind us of that the very fact that there are poor people, that there are dispossessed and marginalized, is of course a very sad thing in our society, and something we should work toward ameliorating and changing. But it's always a reminder for those who are privileged and for the wealthy, that the very fact that the poor exist, the marginalized and the dispossessed exist, is an opportunity for Christians to act like Christians and to draw outside of themselves, to give beyond what's even comfortable. And so that is always a grounding. It's a challenge to be generous, a challenge then to receive God's graces, and that becomes part of it. So almsgiving takes precedence over direct action. And this is something for us to keep in mind also, especially when we start thinking in terms of the indulgences and in terms of crusading and crusader support. remember that as we looked at the Crusader taxes and the clergy taxes and the Saladin taxes and all those taxes that we had talked about in England and France, St. Louis had been involved in and all, there was a very strong sense that if you cannot do the action yourself, that you partake of the action by supporting it. That is ground in what we do even today.
Yes.
As we give to an archdiocesan development appeal, we are giving our money in order to further the good works that take place. So there's a direct relationship in that. Unfortunately, of course, in history there are those super salesmen, there are marketeers who are going to twist this, and like for instance what happens with indulgence sales down the line. But the concept itself is grounded in that. If you can't take direct action, the next best thing, or just as good actually then, is that almsgiving. We have a clearer picture also of a just price in this theology of money, also in the exchange of goods, in the exchange of commercial paper, of money, that it's understood, as we talked about last time around, it was understood that if you were to give someone money, lend them money, that you could expect not only the return of that principal, but also a certain interest rate that would cover the opportunity cost and risk factors also involved. And I'd mentioned Thomas Aquinas in this. I want to give a little citation on that. If you look at and I'm not sure what book it is. I need to recheck that. But it's question 78, and it's under in the Summa Theologica, and it's the title is Sin of Usury.
Okay.
And then specifically under that, in Article 2, he has another question which he answers, whether it is lawful to ask for any kind of consideration for money lent. Okay. And his answer is yes, it is lawful to do that. But that fee has to be tied to, as I had said before, the categories of opportunity cost and of risk, and it cannot be tied to what he refers to as scarcity. That is to say, gouging. So if a particular product, or like what we're noticing right now, gasoline, is scarce, that it is immoral to gouge and to take people simply because of that. Okay.
I keep thinking of those check cashing places, and they talk about the exorbitant fees that they charge people that use those. And
Yeah. Now, there they would have to work out with their spiritual directors how much of that is not so much opportunity cost, but maybe risk. Someone coming in and using that particular means of cashing their check. On the other hand, wait a minute, I think I just contradicted myself. There's no risk. They have the money. So, if it was a personal check, that would be one thing. But if it's a check from a business, the opportunity cost and the entrepreneurial risk is very low. Yeah, I think you're right there, Teresa. They're gouging. Thomas argues, very interestingly, he argues also that a just price is a price that is bargained between the various parties in a free and open market. So that the price itself, we're talking microeconomics here. The price itself is determined in a free and open market, and that's very interesting because as I'm reading some of his comments on this, I'm thinking Adam Smith, who comes along 500 years later with his invisible hand, and yet we have Thomas already doing that. So in that kind of a milieu, Europe in the mid-1200s has really caught its stride, and cities are booming. There is a medieval revolution that has come about, and there's a wonderful historian, Lynn White, from UCLA, I believe, and has written extensively on the medieval industrial revolution, and it's grounded in a number of inventions and discoveries that particularly the Cistercians are going to be involved in. So I'm kind of excited about jumping into that.
Yeah.
Peasants were fat and happy. Beer and wine was flowing. Universities were full of scholars and students. The papacy was respected all throughout Europe as the one unifying factor. Kings and queens and dukes and counts and everything were all doing their own secular thing, but the one thing that pulls all of Europe together is the papacy. And so there is that unifying factor there. Threats were far away. At this point, what you find in the Muslim world is a new kind of growth. This was in the Abbasid Renaissance, so it's a growth in learning. We'll be looking at some of that a little bit later on, and how that learning makes its way into the Western universities. Knights, instead of being a bunch of road warriors, instead are becoming chivalrous. Cathedrals are going up. Monasteries are full of holy men and women. Maybe this is the best of all centuries. Well, one of the foundations for this is laid by Pope Innocent IV.
Okay.
This is that man who had very sad papacy, who was brutalized by Friedrich II, and finally was able to escape from Italy and made his way to France, settled in Lyon. The papacy then, for all practical purposes, was in exile in Lyon. I guess if you have to be exiled somewhere, the Rhone River isn't the worst place in the world. And there he was, and in 1253, he established a new religious order. Now, it's very rare for the Pope to establish an order in itself. He usually has bulls of approbation in which he recognizes orders. And in fact, this order was intended, it didn't last, but the order was intended to be sort of a superset of Franciscans and Dominicans, bringing the two together. These two orders, in fact, on several occasions had obviously cooperated very closely, and at one point it came very close to actually being merged. That was the intention of St. Dominic. When he met St. Francis, he actually had presented the idea that the two orders be merged, and Francis was not terribly receptive to it. He just kind of ignored it, and nothing came of it, which was a very smart move, because the two charisms are so different. They really need to be two separate orders. But here, again, you had the Pope trying to pull the two together in some kind of a concerted effort. The name of his order was the Peregrinantis Propter Christum. Literally, the travelers on account of Christ.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of this is very much influenced by one individual who is not very well known in church history, and that's a shame. And his name is Raymond Lull.
Okay.
Raymond Lull is Spanish. He was actually a Third Order Franciscan. He settled in Majorca. I'm not sure that he's a native Majorcan or not. It's an island off the coast of Spain. It's actually, there's a series of these islands. The two big ones are Majorca and Menorca. Big island and little island.
Okay.
And Raymond learned Arabic, and he saw the dispute that was going on within the Arabic intellectual community at the time over Averroes. Now, we've talked a little bit about Averroes before. We're going to talk more about him because he is so important. It's St. Thomas Aquinas that really takes Averroes and gets Aristotle as a result. And then he does St. Thomas. Some of the brilliance of St. Thomas is that he's able to take Aristotle without getting poisoned by him, I guess you could say.
Right.
That's where Averroes was unable to do that. Averroes swallowed Aristotle hook, line, and sinker. and reason becomes the sole criteria. Abstract reason is the sole criteria for finding truth. That's where he runs into trouble in the Muslim community, which is, of course, a religious faith, and is grounded upon a holy book. And we don't find any references to Aristotle in Muhammad's works, okay, nor the other way around. And so the synthesis between the two is something that is being played out in the Muslim intellectual world. And Raymond Lull sees this as an opportunity to introduce Muslims to a third way, which would be a form of Christianity. And unlike St. Francis, who goes directly and preaches the gospel to the Sultan of
Right.
Egypt, instead what Lull does is he sort of concocts or pulls together his own synthesis of theology and philosophy into what he refers to as theosophy.
Okay.
Okay. This is going to be a combination of theology, which in the Western world is a pulling together a synthesis of faith and reason. And this is the strength of St. Thomas Aquinas. This is the strength of Catholic theology, all right up to today,
Yes.
is that combination of faith and reason. The First Vatican Council was very, very clear as we were going into this age of science that that Catholic theology would be grounded on both lights. St. Augustine, even earlier, so that's a real grounding. But what he does is he then takes faith and reason in theology and then combines this together, synthesizes this together with philosophy. And his understanding of philosophy is going to be pure reason.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Aristotle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, the typical Muslim synthesis of this, as they reject Averroes for the most part, is going to be two separate standards of truth. So within the Muslim mind, there's going to be a sense that faith can teach us one thing.
Oh, I see.
And it is true, even if it defies reason. And yet both faith and reason are true within their own sphere. Now, earlier on, we talked a little bit about Sufism and that mystical rising up, and here attempting to synthesize faith, the Muslim faith on the one hand, and the life experiences on the other. And we do this, we find the truth through mysticism. Now, that's the Sufis, okay? But by and large, most Muslims are willing to live in two worlds at the same time. Obviously, they didn't read St. Augustine's City of God. Okay, but they're going to live in one world and then live in a different world, and they'll shift from one world to the next. And that's how they're able to make peace with themselves. Raymond Lull, on the other hand, is going to argue that natural and natural and supernatural truth is the same. Okay? That faith, faith needs reason in order to make sure that our faith doesn't mislead us into superstitions and errors and doing weird things.
Okay.
You know? Okay.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good.
Okay.
And he argues the other side of that is that reason needs faith in order to carry it to higher realms. You know, that to come to an ultimate understanding of the meaning of the universe, not just how the universe works, but its meaning. You have to have faith. Faith moves into that realm there. He then argues that once faith informs reason, okay, once you get to that point, you reason out as far as you possibly can, and then you take the next step into faith, then that's how you grasp. That's how you apprehend, not so much comprehend, but apprehend the divine mysteries. You know, that's how we come to accept the Trinity. We can see it in Scripture through faith. We see it, preached to us by Jesus. It's revealed to us in the Scriptures itself. But how do we come to apprehend that, grasp that? Well, you can't do it through reason. You've got to do it. You can only go reason so far, and then you've got to take the next step into into faith itself. And so this is an absolute stumbling block for Muslims, especially when you say the word Trinity.
No.
Because they're thinking in terms of three gods, not one. Remember that whole argument about Arianism very early on.
Right.
Jesus could be a prophet, but he can't be God. Not in their mind. And so this is a real stumbling block. And Raymond Lull doesn't back off from that. Instead, he establishes a college on Majorca at Miramar, and it's known as the College of the Holy Trinity. So, like I say, he's not backing off. Okay. In 1311, he attends the Council of Vienne in France, in central France, and there he is commissioned then to set up 6 more colleges similar to the College of the Holy Trinity. And the purpose of that is to convert Muslims. Notice there's a shift. Now, the Council of Vienne, which even discussed the possibility of yet another crusade, instead turns away from crusading against Muslims to converting Muslims in a dialogue that would, it's a sign of the security that Christians have about their own faith, that they're willing to enter into a dialogue with people of a totally different faith, clearly understanding that when it comes down in the end, that the Muslims would see the correctness of the Christian faith and then convert. Well, in 1314, that dialogue continued in Tunis. Raymond Lull went to Tunis, where he had several debates, and in the process evidently said the wrong thing to somebody and got stoned to death for it. He had a lot of followers. There were an awful lot of people. That's why I wish we knew more about Raymond Lull. He had a lot of, they're known as the Lullists, and many of them filled universities, teaching positions at Barcelona and Valencia, notice mainly in Spain. And Spain is a rich interlay at this point of Christian scholars, Muslim scholars, Jewish scholars, all living in the same cities and all talking to each other. And the biggest problem, I think the reason why we don't know Raymond Lull, although we know so much about many of the others living during his time, was that after his death, studying his works and his ideas and his whole concept of that theosophy as a synthesis, they began to realize that, and probably Lull didn't realize this within his own lifetime, but if you carry his arguments to their logical conclusions, what you end up with is a form of rationalistic mysticism. And so it's not going to be the synthesis of Thomas Aquinas. He's not there yet. And of course, he's no Thomas Aquinas either. Who is?
I was going to say. But then again,
yeah. And I think as we look at Thomas Aquinas, in particular, the construction of the Summa Theologica, that is a life project. That is his human project. As a human being, that's the one thing he contributed. But he didn't do that in one sitting. That's an entire life that he pulled together. And not only that, it's a synthesis of everything that was given to him. Thomas would be the first one to admit that the Summa Theologica didn't hatch out of his mind. He's standing on the shoulders of a couple generations before him. He's the great synthesizer that pulls us together. Raymond Lull is not there yet. He never had the tools that Thomas had, but you have to give him an A for effort.
Absolutely.
His life, his teachings, his death, his order, quote unquote, all of this show a new European Christian self-confidence. or say Christian European, self-confidence, a willingness to live out a particular way of life because you believe in it enough that it is going to inform your life. You know? Mm-hmm. And this is a question that people in the 13th century are beginning to ask themselves, and perhaps you need to have the security of a culture like the one of the 13th century, where you don't have to worry about some barbarians coming over the hill and killing you, and you know your chief concern is defending yourself and your family, finding enough food to eat, and all this. The next step beyond that, you know, this is Joseph Pieper speaks about leisure, you know, is
right.
It is the basis for culture, and that is probably, there's an awful lot of truth to that. Mm-hmm. Here now you have an opportunity to sit back a little bit and ask that question, what is worth me giving my life to?
Mm-hmm.
Now we've already seen that answer a couple centuries earlier at Cluny. There were, you know, there were people there, there were monks there who understood that. And they formed then this this monastery, which then ended up, of course, as we've seen, reforming the whole church, saving it from feudalism, ridding it of simony, and restoring the priesthood to celibacy, and all of this within the Benedictine tradition. But with some changes,
right,
and particularly centralized administration, and very importantly, greater community worship. Now, interestingly enough, this has to seem very strange. The very seeds of reform at Cluny, of reforming the Benedictine life. Mm-hmm. Those very seeds had within them seeds of destruction that would bring about the changes within the Cluniac monastery that would make it out of touch, I guess we could say, with a couple generations down the line. Mm-hmm. Okay, like for instance, as a result of spending so much time in the chapel, mm-hmm. there was no manual labor.
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's fine as long as you keep that in mind. But over a couple generations, mm-hmm. what happens is the monks are so tuned into the worship that they disdain physical work. Now, at first, because physical work takes them away from their worship. But, eventually down the line, you're going to have some dandy come along. And I remember this very bad ditty. When I was in the seminary, my hands are made for chalices, not for ugly calluses.
Oh. What happened to the labora part?
Yeah, that's right. Well, see, but isn't that it? The Cluniacs reformed themselves by diminishing the labora in order to have more aura.
Uh-huh. Right.
But there comes a point in time when you have, as I say, these dandies that come along, and the times change, and now there's a disdain mm-hmm. for manual work. Whereas, we've always had within the Christian tradition a great respect for manual work.
Sure.
Certainly all the way down to today. But that happens. The meals become more comfortable. Uh-huh. Because you have to keep up your strength. You're going to be praying that much.
Oh, yeah.
And so everything is zeroed in on very elaborate liturgies. And now you see, the devil has his ways. Even within the best of traditions, one abbot after another, one monk after another tries to outdo the other in elaborate liturgies.
Okay.
So, you're going to have a procession with 200 monks. Well, I'm going to have a procession with 212 monks and 3 monkeys. I'll show you. Oh yeah, well, watch this. I'm going to bring in this. So it became more and more. The music was extravagant. The vestments were rich to the point of being embarrassing. And of course, what happens then is that the real focus, is shifted. you forget what you're worshiping.
Right.
You know. And you can worship very simply. You don't have to have all this falderall.
You don't need the...
When the end of the liturgy is falderall.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Ooh.
Exactly.
Well, unfortunately, throughout the Cluniac world, more and more monasteries found themselves in that kind of a milieu. And at least in one of these monasteries, there is an abbot there who sees that this has gone way overboard and it's time to do some restoration. His name is Robert, and he's the abbot of a relatively small monastery at Molsum in France. And he tries to convince the brothers in his monastery to begin to restore a stricter interpretation of the Benedictine rule, which would mean, of course, getting back to do some manual work. It would mean a simpler lifestyle and getting rid of some of the frou-frous that they had come to love. In the end, he could only get 6 other brothers to support him. Mm-hmm. And the others, there was just great lethargy, institutional lethargy. They were not going to change. And so finally what he did was he gathered the other 6 brothers and he left the monastery. And he went to a small city in France called Citeaux. And at Citeaux, he was aided by the bishop in that area, the Bishop of Chalon, and also the papal delegate, who also saw this great order of the Cluniacs and what they had done for the church in helping the church, now seeing it in kind of wallowing in its lethargy. Mm-hmm. And so all of these are coming together, and they formed this little monastery. And there's just 7 of them. Okay. And they're so good. You know? And they're so good, in fact, that eventually Robert goes back to the monastery back at Molsum and invited some 21 others to join, and they left Molsum and they went to Citeaux. And for 1 year, this was simply known as the New Monastery.
Okay.
After 1 year, the monks back at Molsum sent a delegation to Pope Urban II. I think it's... No, it wouldn't be Urban II. I don't know which Urban it is, but I'll have to check that out. Anyway, they sent a delegation to Pope Urban, and they complained about this new monastery, and that this new monastery was doing so well, and it was helping these men move toward holy lives, and there was holiness there, and there was something there that wasn't at the old monastery, and they asked the Pope to order Abbot Robert back to their monastery so that he would reform them.
Oh, okay. I thought they were complaining about...
So, sure enough, he gets a letter from the Pope. Go back and reform the guys who didn't want to be reformed. They want to be reformed now. So he does, and when he does, he puts one of the original 6, Brother Albrecht, in charge. And this time, when he gets back to Molsum, the monks are... We're clay in your hands.
Okay.
You know, do what you did to the other monastery. And so he basically does. And this then, Molsum in particular, then becomes the center for this new monastic renewal.
Okay.
Now, interesting things happen here. When Abbot Albrecht died in 1109, I think that, now that I'm thinking about it, I think that was Urban II.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. It would have been Urban II. Anyway, when Albrecht died, by the way, he's Saint Albrecht.
Oh, okay.
He was replaced by Brother Stephen Harding as abbot. English-sounding name there. He's an Englishman. And by now, this order was specifically under the protection of the Apostolic See.
Okay.
Okay, so it's answerable to nobody but the Pope.
And this is the group in Citeaux.
In Citeaux,
okay.
yeah. And here you have a shift to, again, a stricter reading of the Benedictine rule, a restoration of manual labor. This becomes important again. Now, Teresa, I'm going to tell you that that's the seeds of decline within that order. The manual labor thing. But that's a story for another time.
Okay.
Anyway, it's a restoration of manual order. It's a restoration of simple meals. It's a restoration of simple liturgies of the divine office, simplified, and to make sure that nobody confused them with the old guys. They wore white robes rather than black robes.
Okay.
They were not intended originally to be different from Cluny, except for the robes that they wore, and simply their hope was to move Cluny and the Cluniac monks back toward the center.
Where they were. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but in actuality, they were. And the evolution makes that much more so. Part of the reason for that is that there is within the whole Cistercian ethos, our spirit, a sense of supervision. They've seen the wonderful work of the Cistercians sort of like spin in a direction that it shouldn't have, and their conclusion is that if somebody had been watching more carefully, that wouldn't have happened. So we're going to watch ourselves very carefully, make sure that doesn't happen. And so part of the whole ethos of what it means to be a Cistercian is to experience a chapter of faults. Oh. That is to say, your brother monks will tell you the truth, okay. Whether it's convenient or inconvenient, and you better get ready for it. That's part of the thing about being a Cistercian, is to be thick-skinned and get ready for when you step out of line, you're going to be corrected. And if somebody else steps out of line, then it's up to you to correct them. And so there's a sort of a whole culture of these chapter of faults that develop, not only on the individual monastic level, brother to brother, but also this continues on into the confederation of abbeys and monasteries. Every year, every monastery is visited by its immediate superior, and he takes the title visitor. In fact, if you get into the modern orders of the 17th and 18th century, the provincials of these orders are often referred to as visitor rather than as provincial. Brother provincial, they're known as brother visitors because they continue that sense of visitations. Now, the highest abbey, of course, is going to be at Citeaux itself. Okay. But it's not immune to visitations. And so within the Constitution, there are 4 monasteries that are going to visit Citeaux. So even as Citeaux is visiting other monasteries, 4 monasteries of the newer monasteries are going to come in. Some of the original ones are going to come in, and they're known as the first fathers, the 4 first fathers. Okay. And these are the monasteries at La Ferté, Pognier, Clairvaux, and Morimont. And Clairvaux is the one, of course, we're most familiar with. Sure. So the abbots of those monasteries every year will go to Citeaux and conduct a chapter of faults for them. So everybody is watching everybody to make sure that everybody's good. Okay. Now, they're going to tell you whether you're naughty or nice. Every year, there is an annual general chapter that takes place at Citeaux. And every monastery, every house is ordered to attend. And everyone submits reports and of what happened that past year, day books and reports and studies, and then those are studied, and then at the end reprimands are handed out, commendations and recommendations. Decisions are codified, and eventually these are all put into a great book called the Institut capituli generalis. And so the general chapters are all codified, and they then become the standard for the entire order, and the entire order is judged against that standard. Every house, every brother. This Cistercian reform spreads very rapidly also to new institutions. Okay. There are previous institutions, Benedictine and Cluniac houses that come over into the Confederation itself. Whole communities do that. Other individuals join these communities. In many cases, there are the military orders. This is the same age of the military orders. Many of the military orders will adopt the Cistercian rule. We've already seen how the Templars did that. That through the effort of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who writes their rule based upon his own. Here are a list of other orders that I came across that adopted the Cistercian rule. And I think, I'll read these, but I think in the end you're going to notice a commonality with most of them. Okay? You've never heard of these monks, these knights before. These are little orders that have gone by the wayside in history. But you have the Knights of Calatrava, the Knights of St. Lazarus, the Knights of Alcantara, the Knights of Avis, the Knights of St. Maurice, the Knights of the Wing of St. Michael. That's an interesting one. And the Knights of Montesa, Spanish. They're very heavily Spanish oriented. As I say, most of these religious orders, these military orders, are very small. They've gone by the wayside, except for somebody's dissertation sitting in some dusty library someplace. You don't hear much about them. But they were all impacted. Besides this, the incredible number of monasteries, of growth of the Cistercians. In 1152, there are 350 abbeys, along with abbeys, priories, and then something called granges. Now, grange is simply a farm. Okay. It's a freestanding farm where instead of a family of peasants running this farm, it's a community of monks. Oh, okay. Probably quite small, 3, 5, 10, 12 monks. And they're all over the place. Let me give you some more numbers. In the next couple hundred years, this comes from R.W. Southern's book, and one of his books. And in 1200, he points out that there are 525 of these establishments. Remember, in 1152, there are 350. Wow. So in just a matter of some 50, or actually 48 years, you've got 175 just added. And then between 1200 and 1300, there are 694 of these houses. Wow. So that's almost 200 added, 175, something like that. And then by 1400, here now we're coming into the Renaissance. There are 712 of these houses. And by 1500, there are 742 houses in Europe. That's a tremendous growth. That's tremendous. It really is. And added to that, there are over 40 canonized saints from that order by that time. As I looked over this and I read as much as I could of people trying to figure out why there is so much growth in this order. This also this exposes the myth that prosperity brings a decline in religious orders. It does. Don't you hear that all the time? Oh, yes, you do. You hear the excuse that, the reason why there's so many vocations in Africa and Asia today is because they're so poor and they just want to get out of poverty. And there is, I'm sure, a certain amount of that. The same thing was used on the Irish seminaries of the 19th century. Oh, they're just trying to get away from Ireland and all. But the reality is that there's something much deeper at work, and certainly there's something much deeper at work here. This is a time of great prosperity for Europe, and yet a tremendous growth in this order. And so I tried to find a couple better answers for this, and I came up with 3.
Okay.
And the first one was, there is a faithful adherence to the rule. And this is admired, and it's attractive.
Sure.
You know, going back again to this thing that we talked about toward the beginning, is when individuals are free enough in a society to be able to say, what do I want to do with my life? What is a worthy expenditure of my life? Many of these people looked to the models of the Cistercians and said, I'd like to be like that. When I grow up, I want to be one of those guys, you know? And that's the attraction. And because they stood for something, they were very clear in who they were. There was no anonymity about this. Then there's a clear direction to go. And so I think that's part of it. The other thing, too, to keep in mind is that people join this order from all states of life. Many of them were members of the military orders. And remember, we had talked when we were talking about the Hospitallers and the Templars that even at one point the Pope even forbade these men from joining other religious orders, monastic orders, because it was depleting the numbers of the knights. Well, he could say all he wanted to. He wasn't going to stop them. These guys found ways. Even some of the superiors, the masters of some of these orders, after they reached a certain age, went ahead and went on over into, and especially the Cistercians. So in a good number of cases, you're going to have people from the highest echelons of society joining these orders and becoming very simple monks. And along with that, you're going to have peasants. These orders were open to everybody, and including peasants. And many of these peasants came as what's known as conversi. That was a rank within that order that's basically the equivalent of a lay brother.
Oh, okay. Okay.
There'll be intellectuals joining this order. There are going to be experts at husbandry. So the farmers and ranchers, for all practical purposes, joining, and they're also going to be architects. And this particular order is going to be part of the popularizing of Gothic architecture. Yeah. So it's a very attractive group of people, and it's open to everybody. So I think that's one reason why the order grew as much as it did. Secondly, there was perfect unity, which is not always true in medieval Europe. You know, and I mean by that.
Today.
Yeah, that's right. But perfect unity and also perfect equality. Every house is like every other house.
Okay.
I mean, they were built the very same way. Every monk sang off the same page. They all wore the same habit. They all ate the same food. There was no privileges for anybody. Everybody got the same thing, you know. And whether you were the visitor or you were the lowest conversi who was out there cleaning the barn, you wore the same habit, you ate the same food, you prayed the same prayers, your accommodations were practically the same. And in fact, there's even a story of the transfer of blind monks from one monastery to another, having absolutely no problem because the monasteries were set up the same way.
Oh my gosh.
So they could go from one monastery to another and would be as if, I mean, the only thing is you got to watch out for the furniture, but otherwise everything was exactly the same. And I bet you any money the furniture was probably regulated too.
Yeah.
And the third reason, and I think probably this is the most important, the greatest catalyst, is one individual. Bernard of Clairvaux.
Okay.
Lives from 1090 to 1153. Goes to Citeaux when he was 23 years old. And he met Abbot Stephen Harding. he becomes absolutely convinced that this is what he must do with his life. At 23 years old, he makes his decision for life. And then he is so convinced of this, he convinces 30 others. The next day he shows up, and the monastery doubled in one day. And it's all because of this man. 3 years later, well, let's call him what he is, St. Stephen, okay, will establish the first four fathers, that is to say, the other monasteries from Citeaux, and St. Bernard is going to be sent to Clairvaux along with 12 others in order to establish the first father there, the father monastery there. He brought with him 3 of his blood brothers. Okay. So there are 12 there altogether. 4 of the 12 are actually blood brothers. Okay. 2 years later, his father, Tessalon, came and joined them.
Oh my gosh!
He's 70 years old, and he'll spend the rest of his life then as a Cistercian monk. It is so attractive that even the Duke of Burgundy went to Clairvaux and petitioned to become a Cistercian monk.
Oh my gosh!
Duke of Burgundy. That's big stuff.
That's huge.
You know what St. Bernard did?
What?
He sent him away.
Oh.
And this is what he said. He said this. He said, "There are plenty of virtuous monks, but too few virtuous dukes. Stay where you are."
So true. You can do more.
And so the Duke went back. Of course, he used St. Bernard for the rest of his life then as a spiritual director. And St. Bernard was spiritual director for many, many very influential people who would love to have followed their life, but we're told, no, stay where you are. God, grow where you're planted. Grow where you're planted. As I say, he was a spiritual director for the rich and famous, for the greats. He was a great guide for the heterodox. There are a few, not many, but there are a few heresies that are floating around, and he'll confront these heresies, but love the heretics. And it's part of the beauty of this man. He is a great preacher of the Crusades, an admonisher of sinful royalty and nobility. Remember what he does to the Duke of Aquitaine. Remember when he refused to see St. Bernard, and remember that he went right to that chapel out in front of his monastery, or his
right outside the door.
Yeah, and then brought the Eucharist right out to that Duke and caused him to have a seizure. Mm-hmm. This is a powerful, powerful man. Think about this. During his lifetime, the Cistercian monasteries went from 5 to 311.
Oh my gosh!
And also he also had influence. As I said, he had influence on the writing of several military orders, but also was influential in the establishment of yet another religious order, St. Bruno's Carthusians, which took an even more strict. I mean, these guys are they're tough.
Right.
And when they put up their monastery at the Grand Chartreuse, whoa. But he had an influence on the establishment of that order too.
Wow.
So, what happens is that fame, and there's, you can't deny it, over that century, 2 centuries, 2.5 centuries, its huge fame is going to bring riches. That's all there is to it. People are going to endow these monasteries and these monks because it's that almsgiving concept. Again, maybe I can't become a Cistercian for whatever reason, but by golly, I'm going to help them in their ministry. I'm going to help them. And of course, a lot of times that kind of help is it hurts an order. Mm-hmm. Gifts and benefices and lands flow to the Cistercians, and yet I have to ask the question, as historians have done, why didn't this corrupt the Cistercians? Because it didn't. Their problem is going to be an internal one that will happen later on. But they're like, this is like water off a duck's back. They're immune to all these riches. And the answers have to be the annual visitations and those annual general chapters in which everybody held everybody else accountable. So that if you received a rich parcel of land and you started using it for yourself, the brothers are going to correct you. We see examples of this. There's a great example in Germany, in Western Germany, in the area of Westphalia. There was a richly endowed Cistercian monastery there. And probably the Cistercians there were a little embarrassed about the amount of cattle that they had and the sheep, and they were doing pretty well for themselves. And probably they were getting some flack from the other Cistercians also. But a famine came across in Westphalia. And you know what these monks did was they went out. The first thing they did was they took all their cattle and slaughtered them all. Slaughtered them all in order to feed the people.
Okay.
They just gave it away. They turned around then, and when they ran out of food themselves, they then took the liturgical vessels, their own library, the monastery library, and they basically gave them over to pawnbrokers, so as to get more money, so as to pay for food, to have food brought in and taken. There was not even a second thought about this, there was always this constant corrective in the Cistercians, because that rich monastery I just told you about is the exception, not the rule. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, what they did was when they received the benefice of land, if it was really good land, the first thing they did was they said, "Thank you very much, really appreciate the gift," and they turned around and they sold it. Mm-hmm. And what they did was they would only keep benefices of marginal land, the stuff that was really lousy land. I'll give you some examples of that. But the side effect of this is one of the reasons for the fast growth of so many of these monasteries, is that if somebody who is not terribly wealthy, but they would like to endow a monastery, to endow a Benedictine monastery, you had to have a lot of money, because Benedictines were like flagships. They were very, very expensive to set up. Cistercians were cheap. You give them some swampland and they'll be happy. If you give them real good lands, they'll sell it. They get rid of it. But if you give them some swamplands, they're cheap, and you get your monastery, and you get a bunch of holy monks who are praying for you. Couldn't ask for anything better than that.
Sounds pretty good.
Just real fast, I'm going to give you some examples because we're about out of time. But in England, they ended up with some these wild moors up in Yorkshire, swampland. They turned it into sheep pasture land, and of course, even to this day, Yorkshire is famous for that area. In Burgundy, they're given the worst land possible, sides of hills, volcanic rock. What are you going to do with that? Wine. Vineyard. So you have wonderful Burgundy wines. In fact, some of the finest wines today, Louis Jadot's wineries, like for instance at Clos Vosgiel, is originally Cistercian. In Germany on the Rhine River, the Kloster Eberbach is a 62-acre gastronomy. Where they experiment with the finest of foods, not for themselves though. They do swamp drainage. In England, there's even a monastery where they put up a monastery near to a spring, and they took the spring water and they routed it through piping through the monastery walls to give them air conditioning.
Mm-hmm. Where was that?
This was in England.
In England.
They do experimentations with water-driven machines, cams. I'll talk a little bit about this next time around. Cogwheels, windmills. And I'll explain a little bit later as to why they're able to do all of this, how they're able to come up with this. But they really are engines of the medieval industrial revolution.
Wonderful. All right, Father, we were really against the clock, so can we close with a prayer?
Sure enough. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.